Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Tonight I'm joined by Inspiring Philosophy from the YouTube channel Inspiring Philosophy. Thanks for coming on tonight.
Oh, thanks for having me. You can just call me Mike.
Mike. Okay, Mike. So were you always a Christian, or what was your upbringing like?
I mean, I was up kind of raised in sort of like a fundamentalist household, which for a lot of kids just kind of pushed them away. And then my journey, to become an actual Christian was kind of a long and complicated process. I wouldn't really say there was ever really a point where I became a Christian. It was a gradual process. Like I didn't have that sort of like come to Jesus moment. It was like a come to Jesus year. It was not for a lot of people. That tends to be what happens is that they sort of start to go along that path, and so they start looking and reading at some of the stuff, and so that's kind of what happened for me. Is that I was sort of like in a church that I didn't want to be in. I didn't really like the kids there, but I also didn't want to tell anyone that I wasn't really following in line because I didn't want to have to deal with the outcry that would cause. So I just kind of set my own way, and I talked to people in private about it, but I didn't really want to come out as someone who didn't like Christian. And then one day somebody challenged me to start reading some apologetic sources. I think someone gave me Josh McDowell's website. I can't remember exactly what it was, but someone also gave me Mere Christianity from C.S. Lewis. And so I kind of read that over a year. Like it's a short little book, but I was reading it like just on and off because I didn't really care that much. And then from after that, it was just sort of like wrestling with different questions and finally coming to the point where I think the evidence was leading me there, but I wasn't ready to take the leap. And so it was just sort of like that slow process. I can't really say it was just sort of like this defining moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, given that your YouTube channel is known for apologetics, when you in that year in which you sort of found your faith again, um, how influential were this sort of like high level apologetics, like the Craig planning a level apologetics?
How influential were those?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, this was like in the early 2000s, I think. There wasn't that much as far as I remember because the internet was still very in young phases. I mean, YouTube hadn't even come out till like 2004, I believe. So I mean, there was not really that much. I mean, we didn't have Facebook back then. It's hard for people to believe that there was once a time we didn't have Facebook. So I mean, you basically had AOL. And for the most part of my life, that was when the internet came out. I mean, it was basically what we would use. It's just AOL for like in the late '90s. So I couldn't really find that much because there wasn't. I don't even think Reasonable Faith was around. Basically, I just had to rely on what I could possibly find, and so it kind of had me digging more because in those early phases of the internet, you just couldn't Google search and get everything you needed. You had to do a Yahoo search, and that was not as successful. So it was just sort of a slow process. I remember coming to Christmither sites early on as I was, and sort of being convinced, but sort of kind of like being like, well, they're not really giving evidence. They're trying to just arguing from like a gap or arguing from silence. So I was kind of disappointed in that. So in some sense, some of those websites kind of turned me on back to Christianity as I kind of felt it was sort of an inadequacy in what they were presenting. It was just sort of this mere skepticism instead of like direct evidence. So it wasn't that easy. You just couldn't like Google whatever you want. You couldn't just go on YouTube and watch videos. It was sort of like oh, here's a book, try this one out. I remember someone gave me one of Ken Ham's books, and I wasn't having it. It was called Evolution: The Lie, and it was like I read like the first two chapters, and I was like, this is just so boring, and I don't even agree with what he's saying. So it was in some ways it was kind of unfortunate because there wasn't that much information available like people have today. But in some ways it was kind of good because it kind of forced me to dig harder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a lot of the Christ Smith stuff, they don't really make positive arguments. They just are hyper skeptical, which if you apply to Julius Caesar would probably mean he didn't exist either.
Right. I usually apply it to like Alexander the Great because our only sources we have for Alexander the Great were not written until 350 years after he existed. Like Plutarch, Arrian, and like just a couple other small ones. All of our information on Alexander the Great comes from sources 350 years after he existed. So it's
Well,
total special pleading.
Oh yeah. Well, not only that, I think the earliest autograph of Caesar's Gallic Wars is from the High Middle Ages.
Possibly, I don't know. I need to research that. I know we have. It depends on which Caesar. If you're talking about Julius Caesar or Caesar
Yeah,
Augustus, it
yeah.
depends.
Caesar's Gallic Wars. That is, yeah. Now, when you in that period when you were becoming a Christian, what was more compelling for you? The sort of like historical evidence for Jesus, or was it the sort of philosophical arguments for the existence of God? Like which was more influential in your coming around to Christianity?
That's a good question. I think in part it was some of the resurrection argument stuff because I remember reading on replies on how they explain away the empty tomb, and there really weren't any good responses. I remember. I mean, of course, this was the young internet, and we didn't have a lot of access to a lot of other sources. Maybe if I had read other sources, I may have turned a different way for a time. But as I got along more in my life, I've read more since then, a lot more. But I mean, I remember reading about that and thinking, okay, yeah, this is kind of hard to explain on a naturalistic account. I mean, why would the disciples steal the body? There's no reason for them to. There's no way they would have gotten away with it. There's no reason for them to make it up. I remember contemplating that for a while, trying to think of a way to explain how the resurrection could be just explained away. I think one of the theories I came up with was maybe like some necromancers took his body to use in like some sort of like sacrificial religious. But I mean, that's kind of ad hoc because there's no mention of like a large portion of that happening in Judea. There's not a lot of that really going around in that time. It just sort of seems ad hoc to even do that. It's so that was one of the I remember contemplating that. Another issue which really came up for me was just sort of like the lack of morality on a atheistic worldview or on a naturalistic worldview. There's really no reason evil would be wrong. A lot of times people cite the problem of evil as the reason they rejected religion. For me, it kind of brought me back to it because there's so much evil in the world in that sense. It's hard for me to say, yeah, that's just natural processes taking hold and it doesn't really mean anything. And I think that's what you have to accept if you reject the idea of theism, that everything is just accidents. There's no ultimate justice. Bertrand Russell said, how can you look into the eyes of a dying child and believe that there's a God that would allow this? Well, the obvious response to that is how could you look into the eyes of a dying child and say, yeah, this is the way life is. There's not going to be any justice. There's no hope for this kid. He's just going to die, and then that's it. He led a life of pain, and that's it. So I think the idea that was one of the things that also brought me back, and I kind of got that from reading a lot of C.S. Lewis because he kind of went through the same struggle when he left atheism.
What was the problem of pain?
Actually,
Was
in
that book
ECF.
influential?
I didn't actually read that at the time. I remember reading some Mere Christianity, specifically Screw Tape Letters was good. Things like that. Of course, C.S. Lewis was an atheist. It was really ever hard for me to recall myself an atheist. I always kind of believed there was something there. I thought the idea that everything just existed for no reason and just came about from nothing was always ridiculous. But I wasn't really. I was more kind of like an agnostic, maybe leaning towards theism, I guess you could say.
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Um, so when you realized that you were a Christian, um, what sort of inspired you to create a YouTube channel that would give out high quality apologetical content?
I was just kind of sick of their YouTube being flooded with atheists and using pretty bad arguments. I mean, that was one of the main reasons, and also because I kept getting in debates online, and I ended up repeating myself a lot. So I decided, why don't I just make a couple of videos I can refer people to, so I don't have to keep repeating myself. So that was kind of the basic idea. I wanted to do some defense of the Trinity and some just basic defense of theism was kind of my initial start. So I did a couple, and I was going to stop, and then some people asked me to do more, and so I decided to do a couple more, and then some people asked me to do a couple more, and the rest is history.
Oh, exactly, exactly. Was the only other YouTube apologist website that I could think of would be Tecton TV with JP Holding. Have you seen any of his content?
Oh yeah, I remember actually coming across a lot of his stuff early on and being influenced by it. He was actually his some of his material is pretty influential, and when I was early searching, and even after I became a Christian, when I was having doubts. So I came across his stuff. So yeah, I'm aware of his stuff as well. Yeah.
Yeah, because other than you, I think only JP Holding is the only other sort of reliable output of content for Christian apologetics. Now, when you became a Christian, when did you get involved in the? I think you mentioned earlier the internet was very limited, so things like Craig or Planning Out or Feather, they weren't really available. When did you start to discover those kinds of heavy caliber apologists?
Later on, I remember watching a Lee Strobel documentary. Oh no, I don't know if it was that. I don't know. I remember watching some video early on of Craig. He still had his beard, so it was older. And I remember watching him on the resurrection, and I thought he was making some pretty good points. Not sure where I saw that. I mean, I'm old at this point. It's 2017. I can't even remember what I did last year. So it's just kind of piecing together what, I remember seeing and what I haven't. I remember coming across him. I remember watching or finding a couple Lee Strobel things. At one point, someone showed me a Kent Hovind debate, and I thought he was a pretty good debater. So I started looking into him, and then I tried to debate some of his stuff with a family member, and that didn't go so well. So I kind of started to move further away from him, and then I was like, yeah, that's he doesn't know what he's talking about. So it was, it's for anyone in that sort of field. It would be stupid to say, yes, I was lost, and then I just found the truth, and I was just set. I mean, I think everybody kind of goes down a bumpy road where they're like going down this path and they kind of turn, or then they decided it's a completely different path. I mean, the struggle for truth is for everybody. It's not going to be such a straight and forward.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things is, as you've sort of been highlighting in this journey that you've been taking, and you see this, the lack of a sort of consideration for this, is the sort of glibness and smugness of the, not just YouTube atheists, but even like the Four Horsemen atheists. It's almost like, are you just like pretending? Most people and most philosophies and most religions admit that the struggle for truth is a long, difficult struggle. There's not this one moment where it's like, aha, I found everything and you're all stupid. It seems like they're the only ones that actually say that.
Well, I mean, I think people across the board do say that. I mean, it just you do definitely get that from a lot of the new atheists as well. That it's just sort of like they're almost anti-theists rather than just atheists. Like they think theism is sort of like a problem that needs to be eradicated.
Oh yeah, exactly, exactly. I mean, I've definitely felt your pain of bad atheist arguments on the internet, um, and you do end up repeating yourself a lot. Now, of the content you created for your channel, what do you think has been your best work on your Inspiring Philosophy
Oh,
website?
that's a good question. I don't know if I had to pick. I'd say maybe the resurrection argument. Honestly, I spent a lot of time researching that. Probably years, really. Um, but the year before I started, or probably about a year and a half before I even put the first video up, I was reading Gerd Ludemann, John Dominic Crossan, Mike Lacona, Gary Habermas, N.T. Wright. I was really trying to get all the information I could on that because I wanted to make sure that the argument was solid. I wanted to hear replies. I wanted to read the arguments for and against. I didn't want to leave a stone understood, so a stone that was not turned over. So I was really kind of proud how that turned out. Um, I think I missed like one point, and I covered it in a follow up video called "Did did the story of Jesus develop over time?" So, other than that, I think the series was pretty well covered, and I challenged atheists several times. Here's the resurrection argument: you want to debunk Christianity? It's quite simple. Give me a better theory that can explain all eight of these facts I listed, all eight of these facts, just a theory that can explain all eight of these facts better than the resurrection theory can. No one has taken me up on that offer to this day. I got very few replies. I mean, Messianic Manic offered some replies, but he didn't ever actually offer a better theory. And I responded to him on my WordPress blog, and then he, completely changed the subject and made up a bunch of stuff so that he could avoid the entire issue totally, which I found hysterical. But that's essentially what happened. I had one guy when I uploaded the first video, he was gonna be like, "I'll offer a reply when you're done," but he never did. So I've never gotten a good atheist reply on that. And a lot of the comments, I'd say about 90% of the comments are not so much oh, here's a better theory to explain away the data. It's you're just wrong because resurrections can't happen, or there's not enough evidence. And I'm like, okay, well, why? Why is there not enough evidence? What more do you need? And they'll give some weird excuse depending on who's talking, but no one has ever been able to offer a naturalistic theory that can explain all the data, being the least ad hoc and being the most plausible. They can't get around certain things without inventing so many extra ad hoc assumptions on top of them. This is sort of the thing you see when you read Ludemann's response when he tries to deal with the resurrection. He's got to invent some elaborate back history of Paul that is contrary to what he says in a lot of his letters.
Oh yeah, exactly. I would have to agree as well that your Resurrection series is probably your best work. I would say of your if we want to go second best, I think it'd be the historical reliability of the New Testament.
Oh
I think
yeah,
that was a very good episode, a
oh yeah, I'm
series
proud
rather.
of that as well. Yeah, I think those are pretty good. Those are pretty solid. They're pretty straightforward with the data. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with those. I mean, it's really hard to refute those, I think. And most people, it's I think they're pretty well presented in a way that most people can understand.
Yeah, I think you might agree with me on this, Mike. Is that one of the main, the real objection to the resurrection is not a lack of a plausible theory on the Christian part, but a commitment to materialism and the idea that the soul and the spirit just ipso post facto cannot exist.
Oh, absolutely. That's the main reason for rejecting it. I mean, I'm sorry, but that's true. This is why you get atheists like admitting this is like it's hard to explain. I mean, it. You see what Gerd Ludemann or John Dominic Crossan have to do to get around it. They have to invent all these elaborate loopholes to get around it. They they cannot just say, "Oh, well, clearly it was this." It's not an easy thing to get around, and I think a lot of atheists don't realize that when they just first hear it. But when they start getting into the details and starting to try to explain away certain things, they start to find the issue of that it's not so easy as you think. And so, I mean, I debated an atheist, I think last May, who has written for the Atheist Republic on the resurrection. And he even said something towards the end. I can't remember exactly what it was, but it's on the Capturing Christianity channel. And he said, yeah, it's not. It is sort of a difficult thing to get around as from an atheist perspective. And I'm like, yeah, exactly. That's one of the biggest reasons why Christianity has a very strong argument for it being true. Is that it has a lot of evidence for it that you just cannot explain away like you could with like other claims of miracles.
Exactly. Since we're on the topic of the resurrection, did you see that recent movie from PureFlix called "The Case for Christ" about Lee Strobel's conversion to Christianity?
No, I haven't. I'm kind of when it comes to Christian movies, I'm kind of like I'm not really a big fan of them for some reason. So I kind of don't really watch a lot of them anymore.
I can understand your feeling, but I've seen it twice. I think it's a pretty good movie. It's something you might be interested just having some fun with at some point. But
Yeah.
um, yeah, I think that Lee Strobel really is a spectacular apologist. He's really good for getting the normies in. William Lane Craig is such a heavy hitter, people might be intimidated. But Strobel has a way, he's almost a C.S. Lewis way of disarming people and communicating complex ideas simply.
Oh yeah, he's pretty good at simplifying that stuff, which I think is good. You need people who are very strong like sort of people like Alvin Plantinga who are going to hit the heavy stuff, and then you need other people to simplify for a layman audience.
I almost feel like that the work that you do and the work that JP Holding does on YouTube is sort of an intermediate. It's a little more complicated than the C.S. Lewis level apologetics, but not quite so overwhelming as the William Lane Craig apologetics that might scare somebody away. So it's kind of almost like a bridge between the two. Do you see that as yourself in any way like that?
I would hope so. I try to simplify stuff as best I can. I mean, some stuff it's hard to simplify when you get into things like cosmology or quantum physics or neuroscience. I mean, that's just going to be complicated in and of itself. But I mean, I hope I'm able to do that pretty well.
I think you do. One of the things is with your work on you haven't you most of what you've done has been what shall we say ecumenical. Does God exist? Did Jesus Christ rise from the dead? Do you plan on the future in getting into any topics that might be doctrinally divisive, like say free will or original sin and things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I eventually want to get into some things like that. I'll probably do a video on Molinism next year. Would be hopefully my ideal. That's in regards to free will and God's omniscience. and where it sits on that. I mean, I'm not going to get into internal theological debates like Calvinism and Arminianism or things like that because I want to focus more on defending Christianity than taking sides on minor things like that.
Yeah. Is there any, in the more ecumenical vein that you've been going, are there any topics that you have not yet covered that you would hope to cover or would like to cover if time allows in the future?
Hopefully, I'll get into Old Testament stuff. I want to get into explaining Mosaic law, conquest. I want to do evidence for the Exodus because there actually is a pretty good case that can be made for it. Uh, so there are things I'm going to start going through the Old Testament. What I'm going to finish up my original plan, which is now that I'm doing a series on ethics and morality. I'm going to do a couple other things in the meantime, and then I'll do a video on problem of hell, explain what heaven is, do a problem on evil, divine hiddenness, just a lot of standard objections, and then I'm going to start going through the Old Testament, starting with Genesis 1, then Genesis 2, then Genesis 3, then Genesis 4, then Genesis 5, then do the flood, then do the Tower of Babel, and then I'll start moving into the rest of Genesis, like why did Abraham sacrifice Isaac, move up to the Exodus, then the law codes in Deuteronomy and then Leviticus, then Judges, or I'm sorry, then the conquest in Joshua, then Judges, and just start moving up through the Old Testament. That's what I'd like to do.
Okay. No, I am aware that you tend to avoid, you call yourself a non-denominational Christian, tending to avoid the denomination wars, which can be so divisive at times. But I have noticed that over the work that you've done, there's been an eclectic mix of positions. Your one video on panentheism, you cited Eastern Orthodox beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
You'll cite William Lane Craig repeatedly, always a good source. Bill Craig's always a good source. So I guess what sort of theological traditions are most informative to your position today?
I mean, probably just I'm probably all over the place. I really am influenced a lot by the thinking of a lot of the traditional, like the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church. I think a lot of like the deep things you get over there are very interesting, like reading Gregory Palamas or Thomas Aquinas. I think are very influential in the way I think. Even early church fathers like Clement of Alexandria, for example, I've definitely been influenced by that. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think where I stand is just sort of like I find myself agreeing a lot. I think a lot of the disagreements between Christian groups like Protestant or Catholic are not as big as people make them out to be. I have found that when I talk to someone who is like, no, if you're a Catholic, you're a heathen, or if you're a Protestant, you're a heathen. And I find if I talk to them more about what they mean, they actually would find they would agree more. I think a lot of it is that both sides are just sort of talking past each other. Like, for example, in the Catholic Church, when they say salvation, they're talking about the whole process, including sanctification. Whereas the Protestants, when they say salvation, they're talking about the initial change the Holy Spirit makes in us. So a lot of times, they're just kind of talking past each other. They mean the same thing, they're just using the terms differently. So I think the different disagreements between the different groups are just kind of minor. So I don't really take sides. I don't really look at myself as being a part of one group and questioning if the other is really Christian or not. So I don't know. I find that when I actually listen to what each side is saying instead of just assuming that I tend to agree with them more than they would realize. And I think both sides would actually agree with each other more than they realize.
Yeah, it sounds like the sort of strategy you're pursuing is something somewhat similar to Thomas Oden's paleo orthodoxy. Um, would you agree with that assessment?
I don't know. I've not actually read anything on that. I would have to read into that to
Hmm,
actually make a
okay.
conscious decision on it.
It sounded like Thomas Oden was a Protestant thinker who wanted to look at the sort of consensus positions throughout Christian history, um, and sort of come to an idea of what would a consensus position look like. That was his particular
Hmm.
project. But one thing that does come up, and it was somewhat controversial, I think probably still is in some of your work, was your particular view of God and quantum mechanics. I think I
Mm-hmm.
watched the 2 or 3 videos you had about that. Now, you said that the universe was a simulation of the mind of God. Now, I know you're using analogical language here, but by a universe is a program running in the mind of God. So, are you saying by that that you believe that the universe is somehow a mental state that God is having?
Not necessarily, no. I mean, uh, we're not part of God's mental states, like, what he thinks and what he wills and what he desires. Um, I mean, we use simulation and hologram as sort of analogies because really these things are not, like, the universe is not actually a simulation. An actual simulation is something that happens on a computer. But that's the best way to describe what's going on there. It's sort of analogous to how the universe would be under an idealistic paradigm. So God sort of sets it up as sort of like a mental construct. Another good way to think of it is like, think of Middle Earth and J.R. Tolkien. Okay, Middle Earth is not part of J.R. Tolkien's desires, thoughts, or his personality, but it is dependent on his mind. It is a world that has sort of been imagined by him and that is sort of like dependent on who he is. So you kind of have to think of it sort of like in that kind of perspective. And the best way to explain this is through analogies. That's why I use a lot of those words like simulation, hologram in the videos I have, because that's the best way to explain it.
Sure. So maybe to use another analogy, whatever God's mental states are, uh, the universe is not one of those mental states. It's a mind-independent object.
Yeah, it is, but it also is dependent on God in that same way. It's not something that just God set up by him, like it's not sort of like a watch that God built that can now exist even if God failed to exist, which of course would be actually illogical to say, but you kind of get the idea. It's
Oh
not.
yeah,
It's not. It's still dependent on God. If God failed to exist, so would the world. Just like if Gerald Tolkien never existed, Middle Earth would never exist. So it's sort of like analogous to that, I guess you could say.
okay, yeah. And your other video, sort of a related video on panentheism. And of course, you, of course, going into that video, realized it would be controversial, either because either people A wouldn't understand what you meant by the word, or B they would, and they might think it's open theism or something.
Right,
Um,
and that's a very important line to walk. You don't want to fall into open theism. That's something that's heresy you do not want to fall into.
yeah. One question I had about that video was I'm not entirely sure what definition of panentheism you were using, because if you go to the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, uh, the panentheism they open up with a simple definition is the world is in God and God is in the world. And so there's a kind of, if you have a Venn diagram, the way I view panentheism would be a sphere, a circle, where the universe and God are identical, so they're totally overlapping. I would imagine panentheism to be, you have a Venn diagram with a God being the larger circle, and then a smaller circle called the universe inside
Hmm.
of God. Um, would that be a form of pantheism you're advocating, or would you be advocating a different form?
No, and this is why I did the same graphs in my video on Christianity and panentheism. No, I would consider myself something like a weak panentheism or a Palamite panentheism, and then I specifically went to the Greek Orthodox fathers who have sort of put forward this idea. So I kind of I made sure I was dependent on what they were saying and not just the traditional understanding of what people typically think of panentheism in the West.
Sure.
I don't want to. I wanted to make sure that people understood. I'm not saying the universe is a part of God's mind and what makes it essential for him to be God.
Okay. So now you in that video you bring up the energies essence distinction. I've followed some Orthodox theology on that, and that's typically used. Are you familiar with the Orthodox YouTuber Jay Dyer?
I do not think I have now.
Yeah, he's an Eastern Orthodox YouTuber. He's been a sort of a critic of Thomism, and arguing that divine simplicity is inadequate, and that the energies essence distinction is a superior account of God's acting in the world. But
Hmm.
from what I understand, the energies of God are God's sort of actions, how God acts in the world. Now, a question that I had is, in your video on panentheism, you argued that the universe was, in some sense, God's energies. Um, but wouldn't that be problematic? Because if the energies are God's actions, an action isn't the same as a created product or an artifact in philosophy. So if you have an artifact, it's not the same as an action. So how can the universe, which we would consider to be a distinct artifact, also be an action?
This is why I go back to the analogy used to sort of explain this. I mean, so like J.R. Tolkien creating Middle Earth was sort of like his action. He sort of imagined this world. It is sort of dependent on his imagination while not being essential to what makes J.R. Tolkien himself. You kind of can think of the world like that, like the actions, the energies of God sort of made the universe. But I wouldn't necessarily say that the universe is God's energies. It sort of is like God's energies made the world in the same way J.R. Tolkien's imagination made Middle Earth. It sort of is the action itself, of J.R. Tolkien making the world, but it's not in itself. It's sort of the product of that. So it's you got to use analogies to sort of explain these very complicated issues. Otherwise, it's not going to make sense because of our limitations in language.
Yeah. So maybe this would be a maybe this would be an analogy that works in the same sense that all Christians agree that there are angelic beings, both good and evil, that are spirit beings, mind distinct from God. I mean, they're not independent of his existence, but they're distinct from him. Made would it be fair to say that, in your view of idealism, the universe and all that it contains is analogous to angelic spirits, that they are mind distinct but also dependent beings on God?
Of course, yeah. It's sort of like that. I mean, you know, I think one of the biggest problems is a lot of people in the West, when they hear panentheism, they immediately think of strong panentheism because of philosophers like Hegel. So that's where they immediately go. They're not actually thinking of what the Greek Orthodox Church has been advocating. I mean, panentheism is actually a relatively new word. It only came about in the 19th century. And so most people attach it to the philosophies that came with it in that time period.
Yeah, yeah. Because like I said, those were some. There were some questions, some clarification questions that I had on those videos, and I was hoping to have this interview as a chance to ask some of those clarification questions. Um, what do you think? Shifting gears a little bit, looking at the work of Christian apologetics. I remember William Lane Craig. I forget what show I saw him on. It was that one Canadian guy. He's become famous now, or maybe infamous, for becoming a sort of feminist Episcopalian now. But he used to run his own. He was a Catholic. He used to run his own TV show in Canada. He had Craig on once, and Craig was saying that, beginning in the 70s, Christian philosophy became kind of mainstreamed again in the academy in a way
Hmm.
that it hadn't been before. What would you say are the sort of the big areas that are in need of exploration within Christian apologetics? In the year 2017, if somebody were to come to you and say, I want to get involved in Christian apologetics and the philosophy, what would be the unexplored areas that people could go into and make a lot of new work?
Well, the first and I think the biggest and most important area is the theory of evolution. That is, I remember watching a video by an apologist who's no longer online. I think he deleted his channel, called The Messianic Drew. And he had a video up where he was kind of ranting a little bit and sort of like lamenting that there really is not a good, solid answer to naturalistic evolution, and we need something in there. And I remember thinking, well, there kind of is. You just got to study more. So I think that needs to be explained more. I think people need to start diving into the theory of evolution, because there actually is not a theory of evolution technically. There are multiple theories of evolution. There are different theories. What most people think of when they think of evolution, they think of neo-Darwinianism. They think that's the only theory of evolution, but that's not true. There are other theories of evolution. And I think if Christians start exploring these and specifically focus on the theory of evolution I hold to, which is structuralism, that can become a powerful argument in favor of more of a theistic worldview, kind of indirectly, I guess you could say. But if you start to study it pretty well, it actually does put forward some good data that kind of refutes that we're kind of here by accident.
Okay. Would there be any other fields that would come to mind that would be open for a lot of new research?
Well, quantum physics, definitely. I think that's kind of um, untapped. I mean, one of the things I kind of am bothered about with Craig is his adherence to a theory of time, and therefore he holds to Bohmian mechanics, which is, I mean, if you study Bohmian mechanics, it's really just an ad hoc, crazy interpretation of the data that is just unnecessary. It's not wrong. It's just overcomplicated, and it doesn't even need to be there because in order to make all the same predictions it does with standard quantum mechanics, it has to overcomplicate everything all the time. So I think, and so he kind of just dismisses what quantum mechanics is looking at. And he just kind of holds the Bohmian mechanics. But I think if apologists start looking more into quantum mechanics, they'll find there's a wealth of information that points to theism that's just kind of staring them in the face. And right now, because atheists like Lawrence Krauss are jumping on it, you can use his arguments against him, like I did in one of my videos called "A Universe from Nothing, Therefore God Exists," where I turned his argument on his head to say, I completely agree with you, but it's not going to support your conclusion of atheism.
Yeah, you know what's interesting? That disagreement that you had with Craig really, I think, kind of highlights the position one can have when apologetics and science reach a juncture. I think Craig's commitment to interpret it this way is more based on a priori philosophical assumption. And the way that you're trying to go with it is saying, we don't, we have this more consensus accepted interpretation, and let's work with that first. So it's rather than saying, here's the philosophical assumption we're going to work with first, and then find a theory that'll explain the data that'll conform to that philosophical assumption. Sounds like what you're, if I'm incorrect, you're saying that no, we can use the current system and we should run with
Right.
it as long as it's
Well, I would disagree with Craig on one of the things he says, which is that he has said multiple times that if the evidence somehow contradicted Christianity, he would still be a Christian. I will never say that. That's completely idiotic to say. Sorry if that offends anyone, but that's not how it should work. And this is something Mike Licona said in his book. You know, he went in the beginning of his book on the resurrection. He said, "Let's say we found the body of Jesus. Would that shake your faith?" And he met a bunch of Christians who said, "No, I'd still be it. It's probably wrong." And he said, "That's you shouldn't do that. You should, if the evidence showed Christianity was wrong, we should reject it. I mean, we should not be believing something just because we want to and not letting the evidence lead us where it is." A lot of the early church fathers said nature is the 67th book of Scripture, or it's the additional book of Scripture. We need to recognize that if there is something in nature that contradicts Scripture, that should give us pause to think because we want to be on the side of truth, not on our side that we just want to be true.
no, yeah, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. One aspect of apologetics that I've done a little bit on my channel is historical apologetics, primarily in the sense of, you know, how the atheists will have this narrative of the big bad dark ages. The church has been suppressing intellectual investigation for millennium and ridiculous things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Have you ever thought of doing a video where you sort of like, you know, debunk the dark ages myth or something like that?
Yeah, once I get through the Old Testament, I'll probably turn to church history and start going up and do, Dark Ages, Gnostics, the Scopes trial, all these things in church history, and just start to do that. And I'll talk about the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, because there's a lot of misinformation on a lot of that stuff that kind of came about from 19th century propaganda. There was a book written called "The History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science," which was just a farce. It made up a lot of things that just were not true, and but people read it and they thought, well, this is probably true, so they just believed it, and it was such a good propaganda campaign. People still believe it to this day. So I'd like to go through church history and do some of that eventually. It's just all in a matter of time.
Yeah, you're not quite one of those YouTube stars and get Patreoned his way through life, right?
Not yet. I'd like to be. I'm trying to work towards it, but I still got to work a full-time job, so it slows me down. I mean, if I could eventually get to where I'm full-time, I could do a video a week, and then I could do like over 50 videos a year. So that'd be ideal eventually.
Well, yeah, with the content, not only the content but the production quality as well. That would be a great asset in apologetics against the atheists and such. Now, as an idealist, did you become an idealist before you were aware of Bishop Berkeley, or did you have any influence on you in that regard?
Not really. Berkeley was sort of like he's more of a subjective idealist. I consider myself an objective idealist. The influence for me was quantum mechanics. That was the first step down there. Then more diving into the philosophy of it, reading philosophers like Keith Ward and reading physicists like Henry Stapp definitely led me there. So that's probably what led me there. It wasn't so much the pure, Berkeley and subjective idealist philosophy.
Hmm. Um, since your own apologetics work has been very interested in the current cutting edge theories of science, were you always interested in science? When did you begin to be interested in these? If you weren't always, when did you become interested in these current theories?
I've always been interested in science. When I first started getting interested in quantum physics was probably back in like 2010 or something. Because I remember in college, our teacher showed us a documentary called "What the Bleep Do We Know?" I think at that time it was called like "Down the Rabbit Hole" or something like that. But I remember watching that and being like blown away by the things in it. And honestly, there's actually a lot of errors in it. So I don't recommend any professors actually show their students this because there are a lot of errors in it. But the stuff that is true in it really got me thinking, and that started like taking me down the rabbit hole, I guess you could say. Specifically, the explanation of the double slit experiment in there. That's when I really first understood what they were talking about, and so I started to go down it in that regards.
Okay, yeah. Now you have done a couple of streams with fellow YouTuber Max Kolbe. I've been on some of his channels as well. How did you first meet Max Kolbe? Did he reach out to you, or you reach out to him?
Oh yeah, he just reached out to me and wanted to do an interview. Tends to be what happens.
That's how it happened today. I just reached out to you, so that's kind of how it goes. One of the things that is interesting is people kind of think if you're a small channel and you want to reach out to somebody that you're going to be likely to fail. But I've been surprised at how often people will say yes. That's
Yeah,
something
I
that
mean, I like helping out small channels because I started out as a small channel. We all did, and it's good to do. So I tell people if you have a video that you want to get more known, send it to me, and I'll if I have time, I'll watch it over and I'll post it to my Facebook page and try to help you get some views. So I think we should help each other out as much as we can, and it's good to get out and talk to more people.
exactly. Um, Maybe in a slightly different tack, who do you think is the most respectable atheist apologist of, with say, the last 30 years?
That's a good question. Maybe Nicholas Everett.
Okay.
He's pretty good. Um, J.L. Mackey's I think is pretty intelligent, although I disagree with him a lot. Um, yeah, it's hard to really say. I mean, because they're going to hit different areas. I mean, there's not a lot of like there is now on the internet. There's not a lot of like atheist apologists that are like professionals at like a university that focus on like just all of atheism and trying to defend the whole world. But you get like atheists in like ethics or like an atheist in terms of cosmology. I mean, you're not going to get. It's much harder to find someone like Nicholas Everett who has written books directly against the existence of God. So it's hard to really say. I guess. I mean, I don't know. That's a difficult thing to really to answer.
Yeah, I think in their own particular fields, Quentin Smith, Graham Oppie, and Richard Gale were fairly competent philosophers, and were and
Hmm.
are. And they would definitely be useful intellectual sparring partners for the budding Christian apologist. But I guess I have a
Oh
question.
yeah, yeah.
If a Christian was just getting into apologetics, where would you recommend they start?
Uh, where you're interested. I mean, there's really no one way to go about it. I mean, their apologetics defending Christianity is such a wide area. I mean, you can start with biblical reliability. You can start with the New Testament or the Old Testament. You can start by defending theological issues. You can start by defending internal issues of the Bible. You can start defending theology, arguments for God's existence, neuroscience, the case for the soul, free will. I mean, there's so many areas that you can dive into. Just go where what interests you. Go where you want to go. I mean, you probably do need to start a little bit in epistemology to try to understand some of these ideas and understand the underlying philosophy to a lot of these views. Because if you're, a lot of times I'll be debating an atheist and I'll realize, oh, the reason they're saying these things is because they're logical positivists. Or the reason they're saying these things is because they don't hold to the correspondence theory of truth, they hold to the pragmatic theory of truth. So I need to deal with that first. So sometimes it's good to get into the underlying things like the epistemic foundations for something, or like philosophy of science, to better understand where people are coming from. But I mean, go where you're interested in. I mean, you shouldn't be studying this unless it really excites you.
Yeah, exactly. And you mentioned just now talking about when you discuss with atheists, and when you know enough of the epistemological foundations, you can kind of preempt why they're saying what they're saying. And one of the things that is so unfortunate, it's not just for atheists, but Christians as well, and the broader population of the United States, is just a profound ignorance of basic logical inferences and self-awareness of basic logical truths. Um, Given that we have this handicap we're dealing with the broader population, what would you argue are the best ways to work around that, so to speak?
Well, you have to recognize what it is for what it is. It's a symptom of a culture that's been drenched in postmodernist BS, this postmodernist philosophy. I mean, they reject logic, they reject truth because those are part of the construct they're trying to overthrow. You know, they want everything into utter chaos. I mean, I'm simplifying, you know, hundreds of books, hundreds of pages written on postmodern philosophy in a couple sentences, but that's essentially the aim of postmodernism. It's attempt to turn, you know, the modern ideas on their head and sort of reject them all. I mean, this is why they reject absolute truth, even though, you know, that is itself an absolute truth. So you just have to show how inherently contradictory it is, how absolutely absurd it is, and how it cannot actually stand. And so when people tell me these things like there are no objective moral values, I'm like, are you serious? So you're going to tell me that it's wrong for these tribes in Africa to enslave and rape women? And they're going to, and a lot of times they'll say, yes, there's nothing wrong with it. I may not like it, but there's nothing wrong with it. And so you have to try to show the absurdity of holding that position, how counterintuitive it is, how a lack of any kind of foundation it has, how it absolute, how the absolute absurdities it leads to, the absolute, you know, the consequences that are from this. Of course, you don't want to just appeal to the consequences because that'd be fallacious reasoning. But I mean, you can sort of use that in sort of just to show, you know, if you as like sort of like a supporting and indirect argument, I guess you could say. Um, but you need to just point out for what it is. It's absolutely absurd when people start using logical positivism or verificationism. You just got to show how absurd it is. I remember one time, and sometimes people are just idiots. I remember one time some guy was telling me something is not true unless it's been verified by science. So I told him that's just verificationism. That's a failed philosophical position. You can't verify the verification principle. And what he thought was that verificationism just meant science, that to verify something scientifically. And he's like, yeah, of course I'm a verificationist. I believe you should verify stuff by science. What's wrong with you? I'm like, no, that's not verificationism. Verificationism is a philosophical position. But he didn't get it. He was just too stupid. And so sometimes people are just so stubborn and prideful. They don't want to get it. So sometimes
Well,
you just can't help them.
yeah, it's the Dunning-Kruger effect, right? You just can't help them at that point.
Yeah.
And that's unfortunate. But when you get to that point, there's not a lot that you're able to do. One thing that's would be interesting, and I think Christian apologetics haven't really delved into it a lot, is rational reasons to believe that angels exist. I think you can argue that God exists from first principles. I don't think you can argue that
Mm-hmm.
angels do, but I think there's evidence for angels that are more uh, inductive rather than a purely, first principle argument.
Oh yeah, that'd be interesting. This study and see what people can come up with. I've not really explored that myself, but yeah, that'd be interesting to see people tackle more in the future.
Yeah. So we're nearing the end of the interview. Is there anything you'd like to leave us with before we wrap this up?
I can't think of any ancient Chinese wisdom to end on that would inspire people across the board. I don't know. Don't make sure you read your books. I don't know. I can't think of anything off the top of my head.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, Mike, and make sure to listeners to check out Inspiring Philosophy's YouTube channel. He's got a lot of quality content. We mentioned specifically the historicity of the New Testament, the resurrection. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.